Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Thursday Night Bible Study, Deep Calls to Deep. This is Friendship Bible Church, and we are in Judges chapter 16. So we're moving right along. It's been a blessing so far. Before we start today, let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask His blessing for tonight's study. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for everyone who came out tonight and those who are watching at home. We just thank you for this study. We thank you for all the things we've learned about you. We thank you for all the things that you are teaching us through your word, in not only just the book of Judges, but in every book that we study and every word that you give us. And we just appreciate and are thankful for the freedom in this country to be able to serve, to be able to study, to be able to have this freedom to get together multiple times during the week and study your word, Lord. I just pray that you'll open up hearts and minds tonight for those here and those who are at home. And I just pray for the study. Give me the words that you want me to speak. And I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Everybody read Judges chapter 16? Good. Make sure you read ahead. Before we begin tonight, or as we begin tonight, we'll start out like we always do. Let's just review last week, Judges chapter 15. Okay, last week, we studied a few of the exploits of Samson in chapter 15. Samson, after what was probably about 8 or 9 months, decided that he really wanted this Philistine girl that he was going to marry previously. Now, he chose to let go of whatever resentment that he held and tried to see if that maybe he could still have this girl. So he showed up at his, quote, wife's house to claim her with a young goat. Now, whether this was his way of making up for abruptly leaving the wedding ceremony and offending this family, or it was Samson's attempt at negotiating a sedikah, which we talked about as he's a visiting husband. Maybe it was not necessarily a sedikah, but maybe he wanted a lesser marriage with this girl. We're not really too sure what happened. But either way, it doesn't really matter, at least for the doctrine and the technical stuff of the story, the truths that God wants us to have. It really doesn't matter either way. The thing here is he couldn't have her. He could not have this girl because her father had given her to one of his 30 companions from the wedding banquet. More than likely, this person was Samson's best man. Now, the father explains that he thought that Samson hated her since he probably found out that she betrayed him. Now, I think I explained last week, I think the man was being honest with Samson. I don't think he was lying. And no doubt, this man was also afraid of Samson, since he was probably aware of the 30 Philistine men that Samson killed in Ashkelon. And the other rumors about, revolving around basically Samson's propensity for violent outbursts. Certainly this man did not want to cross Samson. So I think that had a lot to do with it. So he offers Samson his younger daughter, asking, is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Well, Samson was having none of it. He decides to exact revenge for what he saw as a slight against himself. He does this by lighting the Philistine wheat fields on fire, along with the vineyards and tree groves. But he applies this revenge in a very cruel way. He captured 300 foxes, or more likely jackals, and tied the pairs together tail to tail. Then he placed a torch between the tails and lit them on fire. The jackals were then released into these fields as they raced off in a panic, most of them either dying or being badly burned or traumatized. Now, as you can imagine, the local Philistines were not too happy about this, and it didn't take long for someone to name Samson as the culprit. But who would want to deal with this man? And I don't think they wanted to deal with this man. So they decided to take out their own revenge against the father and daughter, basically blaming them for their troubles. It certainly was a much safer choice. So they chose to get their revenge on this father and daughter. The local Philistine mob came up and burned the man's house with both himself and his daughter inside. Now, last week, I don't know if I had brought this out, but the irony of this situation was that this daughter had betrayed Samson so that she could save her father's house from being burned down originally at the wedding, chapter 14. And now her betrayal was coming back on her own head. The house gets burned down anyway, with her and her father's life being forfeit as well. Samson, after hearing their treachery, he decides to make them pay for a tragedy that he was responsible for creating. He kills a lot of these local men with his bare hands or leg on thigh. It's the idea. It's a wrestling move, hand-to-hand combat, no weapons. Finally, Philistine leadership is getting reports about Samson's actions in the Timnah area, so they send some armed troops north and camp in the area later named Lehi, which means jawbone. Lehi was within the tribal territory of Judah. Judah sends a delegation to inquire as to what is the meaning of this military gathering. They inform Judah that they have come to bind Samson for all that he has done to their people. Judah makes a deal with the Philistines. They will bring Samson to Lehi in chains, or in this case, in ropes. And in exchange, they would take Samson and peacefully leave Judah's territory. Both sides agree. 3,000 Judean men are sent to go get Samson. You think they were trying to be a little careful there? 3,000 to 1? So they find him at a place called the Rock of Etam. And they are really upset because Samson has just ruined their day. His antics are causing a disruption in the peace that they unlawfully forged with the Philistines in the first place. They ask Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us?" His own countrymen are ready to just hand him over to the enemy because they would rather just leave things the way they were. A sort of status quo. Why upset the fruit basket? Why upset things? So, lack of instruction in God's word and syncretism we've talked about before has left this lead tribe without wisdom. This sad situation does offer the modern believer great application in their own lives, in our own lives. How many times has God asked you to get rid of something in your life? And for this example, let's say a bad habit or a harmless sin, but ultimately, you're willing to live with it. It's like you and that bad habit or harmless sin have an uneasy peace here. I mean, most of the time, if this bad habit can stay over here and I'll stay on this side, I can live with it. Battling that sin is just going to upset the status quo. You won't take a stand against it because it's just easier this way. No need to upset the balance. Basically, the attitude that the tribe of Judah is taking with the Philistines is the same attitude that we sometimes take with sin. And when I say we, I always mean the body of believers, not just we in this room. Myself included. So they bound Samson and brought him to the Philistines. But then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson. After breaking his bonds, he found a fresh jawbone and killed 1,000 Philistine soldiers. This great slaughter left Samson tired, thirsty, and vulnerable, so that he cried out to God for help. And as he did for Israel in the wilderness, God provided water from a rock to revive Samson. Samson named the place En Hakor, or the spring of the caller. Now, we finished last week with one final exploit of Samson in the Philistine city of Gaza. He went down to the city for reasons unknown and went into a harlot. This means that Samson was probably staying at a local inn. Some men of Gaza surrounded the place thinking that they could ambush Samson as he left in the morning. Well, he awoke at midnight instead, and possibly aware that they were there, or maybe he was warned. He was being made aware of the threat. Either way, he made his way down to the city gate. The gate would be shut and locked for the night to keep people out of the city, not really to keep people in. So they always locked it. So people just, at a certain point in time, nobody else is allowed in the city. That's why they did this. Samson decided that this was no problem, or this wasn't going to stop him, so he broke the locks, and then he lifted the heavy gates, pressed them on his shoulder, and then he walked those gates down a road that led east to Hebron, which is a city about 40 miles away. And finally, he placed them down on a mountain that had a view of Hebron in the distance. So we're not really necessarily sure how far he walked these gates, but he didn't set them right down outside the city. He walked them and dropped them off on the mountain. So that was last week. All right. And now we are in Judges chapter 16. So let's turn in our Bibles, Judges chapter 16, and I'm going to start reading at verse 4.
Make an observation at this point.
Sure.
Seems like so many of his decisions are being governed by the flesh, totally like removed from like wanting to do God's will. It's what Samson wants. Even when he was with the wife on his wedding day, and then there was the scrap, and he leaves, he doesn't come back till he feels like coming back.
Right.
You know, it's just very kind of like reminds us a lot of who we were before we knew Christ, right?
Right.
Just governed by the flesh. But then at different moments, we see that God had a purpose for Samson's life because the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, you know, to fight the people at the one place and then at the next place. It seems like, you know, it's so much different than believers in the church age who have the indwelling presence of the
Right.
Spirit that he never leaves us. For Samson, he looks like he goes his own way for a long time, gets in a big scrape, and then God sends the Holy Spirit to give him extra power to meet that situation.
Right. Yeah. Pastor George, just to wrap it up, he's just talking about how Samson was led by the flesh. It seems like most of his life, and the decisions resulting from that are usually bad ones, right? And then the Lord gives him power, but you know, it's using this flawed man to accomplish his own purposes. And so no matter what, he uses Samson, you know, to accomplish his will. Yes?
It doesn't explain how he got by the troops that were outside of the gates waiting for him.
Well, yes, it doesn't, but if you
He lifts the gates up.
No, it wasn't the gates. They surrounded the house.
Okay.
So what I was trying to say last week is my best guess, because it doesn't. As a matter of fact, I think if you watch like Samson Delilah, the movie, he comes out of the place and he starts busting his way, and the whole crowd is behind him, and he's at the gates, and they're all like surrounding him with torches, and he lifts them up and he goes. They expected him out in the morning. So I could imagine that let's all get some shut-eye, and most of them are probably asleep with a couple of scouts. Right. Samson may have been warned and may have snuck to the city gates, but I've read other expositors say there's no way that Samson snuck anywhere. He came down, walked right through the middle of them, and they were half asleep and didn't know what to do. We don't know how far these city gates were. They could have been like right down the block. And so now we have their ambush is ruined because they think Samson's coming out at 7, 8 o'clock, or whatever. Right. Their ambush is ruined, and now we got this crazy man who nobody wants to mess with, and the ambush is ruined because half of them were asleep. I think that's the idea of what happened. Samson had to have known what was up when he came down and out, or maybe even been warned. So I think that's the reason why he doesn't fight his way to the city gate. It had to do with the time. They thought he was coming out in the morning, but he came up at midnight. So it was kind of a surprise. And then when he lifted the gates up, they left him alone. Nobody was going to go chasing him out of the city. He's gone. All right. We're going to let him go. But anyway, that's how I thought about it. And I thought the same thing, Jim. But what is the explanation? How did he get from the inn or from the harlot to the city gates? A good question. It doesn't give us the details there. Did any other questions or comments over last week? Oh, a question from last week?
Oh, no.
How am I going to get through this week?
It's quick.
All right, it's quick.
It's a quick question.
All right, quick question.
So in chapter 15, verse 20, it says, "And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years."
Right.
What does that infer?
That infers that from the time that Samson was called, right, at the end of chapter 13, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahanaim, right, between Zorah and Eshtaol. We have that in chapter 13, verse 25, right until he's killed. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but at the end of this chapter he dies. But probably, yeah. So,
Spoiler
sorry about that, spoiler alert. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but from then until that, it's probably 20 years. It's basically what it's saying. So we just read a couple of instances, so think about how much is missing from really Samson's life. It's just, we just get these chapters. That's it.
So he didn't really judge.
Absolutely right. He didn't judge in the sense
But he
that
was the judge.
God called him as a judge. The author makes that clear. But he certainly didn't judge like any other judge. Every other judge we've looked over had some sort of authority, rule over men. Even the ones that were minor judges were somehow had some sort of authority over a tribe or a group of people. And the other ones were all military leaders who led some sort of military charge. And then they retired and ruled their tribe or a group of tribes for a long time. Samson was not like that. Remember, Samson's judgeship was like out of the norm.
And he's more like a deliverer.
He was raised by God to deliver or to start to deliver. He was never raised by God to end. Just like every other judge, right? After the battle, that oppression is gone. You notice that Samson dies, the oppression isn't over yet. Samuel still has to deal with that, and David does as well, the Philistines. So Samson was not raised to end the oppression, but to start the trouble. He was beginning this, sort of lessening and stirring up trouble and creating a strife. As you know, none of the southern tribes cried out to the Lord, right? They didn't cry out to the Lord at all. That means they didn't care. They were okay with the Philistines. They seemed to be okay with the fact that they were rulers over them. So God called Samson, not as a result of, you know what I'm getting at? The people didn't cry out, and then a judge was raised. God intervened in this case. He called Samson because the people didn't call or cry out to the Lord or go to the Lord. They were just fine with the Philistines. And the fact that the Philistines were ruler over them, as long as they had a little bit of peace, you see the tribe of Judah didn't care. So God had to call Samson himself, and Samson was the only judge that wasn't a result of the people crying out in some way. Right? So Samson definitely breaks the mold. We have the mold that I developed over all this time. Samson breaks that mold.
Okay, because he goes from, he's judging over Israel for 20 years, and then he's with the prostitute.
But that whole time that he was doing all that, he was judging. So you want to think that he's sitting behind like with a gavel in some sort of leadership role. Samson's judgeship did not involve any leadership. He never led men. We don't even see any, we're going to talk a little bit about this. Where's his friends? He didn't even lead a band of men. He was a one-man wrecking crew. He was a one-man thorn in the side of the Philistines. And you know what? That's what the Lord wanted, because he was not going to allow this peace to continue. And so, yeah, when we think about Samson, we got to go out the box that, we've developed over, 12 chapters and just see him as different.
Okay.
Yeah, so when Samson judged Israel, it's definitely in a different manner. It means during the time that he was creating all this trouble, from 13 verse 25 till the time he is killed, was a 20-year stretch. All right? All right. Question?
I was just going to kind of piggyback on what Pastor George had said. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson. He was actually called to be a Nazarite, so he really should have had self-control, but obviously he didn't. His flesh
Right.
got the better of him all the time. But as a Christian, when I read this, and knowing what the New Testament says, there's just so many wonderful applications here, because the Spirit of the Lord now strengthens us inwardly so that we deny ourselves. We don't take vengeance. We don't try to get people back when
Right.
they hurt us. It says here, he broke the locks and lifted the heavy gates and placed them on his shoulders. I mean, that's just such a neat statement to me, because I look at it, well, what will that say to me? Well, Jesus said he breaks the power of sin in my life, right?
Right.
Which is what we need him to do. And then he shoulders the responsibility for our lives, but he also at times tells us he places things on our own shoulders that we wouldn't normally take. But if the Spirit of God is dwelling within us and leading us, we do what we wouldn't normally do.
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah, so,
And a lot of Samson's life, he wasn't led by the Spirit.
right, exactly.
Good. Anything else? I reserved a time at the end for some applications from Samson's life, and you guys are coming up with them now, so it's good.
I think it's
Keep 'em
interesting
coming.
that the Lord, like you said, the country had become easily living with the Philistines, and so because they wouldn't, the people wouldn't revolt, the Lord steps in and has, raises Samson,
Right.
so that, like Mary was saying, the Lord's not going to let us live outside of His will for any length of time without, especially now that we're indwelt with the Holy Spirit. He's not going to let you live in peace outside of His will.
Right. Right. So, yes, he's going to step in. He's going to right the ship. He's going to rescue his people. Even if they're not faithful, right? God is faithful, kind of the idea. Yeah, and like I said, it's bad because you have some really bad things occurring in the time of the judges, and to see a lead tribe like Judah, and none of them in the southern tribe, amongst the southern tribes, even crying out to the Lord for help, it shows you how far they've slipped. All right, good comments, good way to start. Any other comments or thoughts about chapter 15 and 16 verses 1 through 3? All right, let's continue on. I'm going to start in verse 4. I'm going to read all the way to verse 21, okay? So I'm going to read a little bit. So, Judges chapter 16, starting in verse 4, reading to verse 21. All right. After this, it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Entice him, and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength is, and how you may be bound to afflict you." And Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. And now she had men lying in wait in the inner room. And she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the cords as a string tow snaps when it touches fire, so his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have deceived me and told me lies. Now please tell me how you may be bound." And he said to her, "If they bind me tightly with new ropes which have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." For the men were lying in wait in the inner room. But he snapped the ropes from his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Up to now you have deceived me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my hair with a web and fasten it with a pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his hair and wove them into the web, and she fastened it with a pin and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin from the loom and the web. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me?" I'm just reenacting how she must be saying it at this point. "How you said you love me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is." And it came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her that all that was in his heart and said to her, "A razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." When Delilah saw that he told her all that was in his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up once more, for he has told me all that is in his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. And she made him sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains, and he was a grinder in the prison. And we'll stop there and continue after this. The story of Samson and Delilah occurs after an unspecified amount of time from the events in Gaza in verses 1 through 3. So we don't know how long between the verses. So between him taking those gates out and the time of this story, some amount of time has occurred here. Now, verse 4 implies that Samson continued to visit Philistine territory and Philistine cities. Because here he is again in a Philistine city with a story from a Philistine city, not a Hebrew city. He visited those cities possibly because of the temptation of Philistine city life and culture. It might have been one of the reasons why he visited there. Now, if Samson was part of, let's say, the merchant class, he came from a family of merchants, we may be able to deduce that Samson had some great trade relations with the Philistines, and these, in fact, may have been business trips. But this was not the case. So I find that it was not business, but rather pleasure that Samson was seeking. You know, when you go on vacation and they ask you, is this business or pleasure, right? It's the same thing here. Business or pleasure, Samson? And I think it was pleasure. Now, one of the top temptations and greatest draw for Samson seems to be the women, Philistine women. So in verse 4, we find that Samson has fallen in love with a new Philistine woman by the name of Delilah. Now, we've talked about this before. I'm just going to mention it real quick that some of these names are monikers given by the Hebrews to describe the person. Remember, we talked about names, right? So Delilah might not have been her Philistine name, but we're not too sure about that. But remember, some of these kings were just monikers. They weren't their real name. But what happened is they can't come up with a basic definition like they normally do about what her name actually means. So that's why I'll just give that to you. There's some discussion out there if you read enough commentaries. Not important. Now, it does not say that she was a harlot, but this woman wasn't Samson's wife either. This was an illicit relationship. It's really what it was. Now, the valley of Sorek, only mentioned here in Judges chapter 16, was thought to be just south, but close to the town of Timnah. All right, so it's the same general area. We know that this area was controlled by the Philistines. Okay, so the setting of this story is really not too far from the events of his failed marriage in Timnah. So probably just a little bit south of Timnah is where this valley was. Now, before we move on with our story, I wanted to take a brief detour and talk about the overall life of Samson. Understand that these 4 chapters are not, and actually just as we discussed this beforehand, right, we just went over this, they're not a comprehensive history of this judge, but rather a representation of his life and deeds. I mean, we have 20 years and we get it in 4 chapters and just a few events. So the author and the Holy Spirit have chosen these specific events, and probably because they were his major conflicts with the Philistines. They were the major ones. He might have had other skirmishes and other stories and other problems, but these are the major ones that he had. And the author and the Holy Spirit used these events as a warning that I think is true for the reader in 1000 BC as they look back 25, 30, 40 years before and look at the life of Samson. And it's so true today with the church. Samson represents God's people, chosen and set apart. The Philistines represent the world with all of its temptation and promises to fulfill every desire apart from God. And we know Samson did a lot of that, right? Throughout these chapters, Samson has major trouble with being able to separate himself from the pagan world, as we find him time and time again inside Philistine territory, indulging in practices that a believer should not be involved in. He is more comfortable hanging out with the unbelievers than with his own brethren. We talked about that. Not a friend, not a mention of a girlfriend, a lover, nobody from his own people. But the stories we find, he's constantly in Philistine territory. The whole idea of the conquest of Canaan was to clear out the promised land of all pagans so that God's people would be free of the influence of evil. As Christians, we are called to be in the world, but not of the world. 1 John 2:15 says, "Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." We, very much like Samson and the Israelites, are called to be different from the world around us. Yet too many of us get real comfortable with the world. Sometimes we even hang on to it with all our strength. Now, at times we want unsaved people to see us as different, right? We're Christians. We want to be a little different, but not too different, to the extent that we don't want to be thought of as oddballs or intolerant or offensive. And just a thing on what's going on now in the news and what we're having in our country now, and I just fear that this is going to happen soon, that soon will be thought of as a rebellious voice that needs to be silenced. Christian views and Christian doctrines are not going to be tolerated any longer, and we're heading there pretty quickly. In addition, there are parts of this world that we may come to love. We have sports, movies, celebrations, and I just use those 3 as just an example. You could fill in whatever and fill in the blank with a bunch of different things. There's lots of things in this life that we just can't imagine giving up. Now, there's nothing wrong with sports, movies, and celebrations per se. I'm not attacking anybody's hobby, anybody's love. That's really not what I'm intending to get at here. But I'm saying this: anything that takes the place of activities that build up your faith and strengthen your relationship with God can be a problem for you as a believer. We cannot serve two masters. Why? What is the problem with serving two masters? What did Jesus tell us?
You can't do it.
Why? You're going to what the one? You're going to love the one, and you're going to hate the other. Right? And the idea is if you love the world and the things of the world, you're going to end up, the things of the Lord become, less important. You might not hate them per se, but they take the back seat. That's in Matthew 6:24. So if your love for movies, sports, and other celebrations supersedes your love for the things like Bible study, prayer, and church gatherings, then your growth will be stunted. That's the result. Samson is a walking, talking example of this principle. He should have spent more time with God's people and less time with the Philistines. Now, God used that because his time with the Philistines stirred up trouble, and, God's will was done. But Samson seemed to have little love for these Philistines, so weird, and yet here he is again in Philistine territory and in love with a Philistine woman. This lack of judgment will be the final one, as it will cost him his life. Spoiler alert, sorry, I already let the cat out of the bag, so now you guys know. Verse 2 implies that Samson's relationship with Delilah had apparently become well known. It caught the attention of the 5 lords of the Philistines, who saw this as an opportunity to destroy this one-man gang. Earlier, we talked about how Samson was wrecking the day of the tribe of Judah because of the trouble he was creating for them and their treaty with the Philistines. Well, Samson had been a thorn in the side of the Philistines for almost 20 years at this point. They were desperate, and they knew that defeating Samson by sheer force never worked. So they chose to employ a bit of stealth here. They asked Delilah to use her womanly wiles to find out the secret to Samson's strength. They understood that the type of strength that Samson owned was magical in nature. His size and muscle alone could not explain the things that he did. Now, in their mind, in their pagan mind, this is magic. Something's going on magically here. We wouldn't think of it as magic, obviously. Now, apparently, Delilah was a dedicated worshiper of the Philistine god Dagon and a loyal subject. She readily agreed to be part of this conspiracy. The money must have been a deciding factor, too, as they offered her 1,100 pieces of silver per lord, right? Meaning that she would collect 5,500 pieces of silver. Now, let me give you an idea of how much money this was. 1,100 pieces of silver is valued at a year's wage for 110 years, and if you do the math, 10 pieces of silver per year. She received 5 times that amount. So she could have fed all of her family and some distant relatives as well, maybe a full village with these pieces of silver. It was a lot of money. Maybe that was a deciding factor. So in verse 6, the game begins. Delilah casually asks Samson about the secret to his great strength. Now, I think the appropriate view of this back and forth between Samson and Delilah is that Samson never even considers, it doesn't even cross his mind, the possibility that Delilah could get the truth from him, or that even giving her the truth, the danger might be present. I don't think he even considered the repercussions of what he was doing. I think he toys with her the same way many believers just play with sin. Again, nobody in this room, but we do have a lot of brothers and sisters who just play with sin, toy with it, never considering the harmful repercussions that may befall them. Remember that Samson likes playing games, and he certainly did not take this situation too seriously. Now, we are the ones reading and shouting, "No, Samson, no," right? We know the danger. We see it. And, so when you look at Samson, you see this back and forth. He just can't see it. We have the scriptures, and we can look back. We know what's coming. He didn't. For a couple of different reasons. One being that I think he saw this as a game. He was toying with her, never even considering the danger of what he was doing. So Samson tells his first lie of the game, and in verse 7 he says that if he is bound with 7 fresh cords, then he will become like any other man. Now, first of all, these are 7 fresh bowstrings. That's what cords are. And these bowstrings were very sturdy. They were made usually from twisted gut or from the tendons of an animal. They were supposed to be fresh or new because new, moist, when bowstrings are new, they're moist, right? They were usually, the new, fresh, moist bowstrings were the strongest and the most durable. Lastly, the number 7 was seen as a sort of magical number to the ancient pagans. I think that's where we get lucky number 7, right? In our own culture now. But in the ancient times, 7 had meaning. The point here is that Samson made this lie plausible so that Delilah would believe him. That's why it wasn't 5, it wasn't 4, it was 7. So she gets a message to these lords who supply her with the bowstrings. Now, one night she ties him up. Probably, I'm going to say that most of these instances occur, and I'm trying to keep this PG-13, after the throes of passion. And I can only assume that he got very tired after these throes of passion and was completely vulnerable. Again, only a guess. I'm just throwing that in there. He seemed to be asleep a lot. Sorry. But notice in verse 9 that being a pretty clever woman, and maybe even sensing that Samson was lying, she had the men who were charged with seizing Samson, well, she had him lying in wait in another room. That's what that idea is when you read these verses. See, she tested his story by saying, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." Now he's startled awake, and Samson instantly snaps the bowstrings, and then she knew that he had lied to her. But the brilliance of this plan is that she had the men in the other room to stay hidden until she possibly gave them some type of signal so that the ruse would not be found out. See, if Samson, I hope you get this, if Samson snaps the bowstrings and at the same time the men burst into the room, he would have probably instantly killed them, more than likely, and he also would have known that she was working against him. The ruse would have been up first try. So it was important to set this up this way so she can continue just in case he lied. See, up until this point, she can actually deny any bad intentions, but rather say that she was only testing his love and devotion to her by tying him up. She only wanted to test whether he would trust her with the truth. This is plausible deniability, right? So if he turned her and said, "What are you doing tying me up?" She did have an out. He was just trying to see if you were lying. You lied to me. And then, of course, she would have went right to verse 10, because verse 10 is about how she tries to pretend to be so hurt, to be deceived. "You hurt my feelings. You lied to me. How could you do that?" So even if he did start badgering her, that way, she was generally badgering him, but, she could have acted hurt. And women in this situation usually get their way. Am I being sexist by saying that? Oh,
It's funny though, because how the accuser is really the liar,
the liar. Right,
and that so often happens. Makes sense to her.
right. And he causes it because he's playing. Instead of guarding this secret like he should have, he's not. You know? He's playing a game, and he's going to get burnt. We know that. So in verse 11, he tells her the next lie, which has to do with being bound with a new rope, right? Now, new ropes are the same thing. They're moist, and they have not been weakened by use. They're like a lot stronger than old ropes that are kind of frayed and they dry out and they can be pulled apart. I still don't think I could do even an old dried out rope, but the way they tied him at least. But new ropes are very strong. Now, both the ropes and the bowstrings, eventually what they do is they dry out and they snap. You can't use them anymore. Once again, this lie has credence unless she knew what happened at Lehi, right? The funny thing is they tried fresh ropes. That was the same thing that the tribe of Judah tied Samson up on. So she apparently doesn't know that, and neither do the 5 lords of the Philistines, apparently. But he's tied up the same way, with new ropes, same idea. So she sets up the same, Samson is playing with fire, but seems to be blinded by his own passions and lusts. I mean, this is what happens because this affair is illicit, it's wrong, it's bad. And he's just driven away by his passions. So I don't think it's just about a game to him that he just wants to play. I think he's also blinded by lust. He's blinded by passion, not love. I think lost in the translation here is the fact that Delilah probably has started to step up her womanly game, really playing with Samson's emotions. If he really loves her, he would certainly share this secret with her. So the game continues. Now, verse 13 and 14 can be rather confusing, but he tells her to weave his 7 locks of hair and fasten it to a loom. Now, what I did is I put a loom up on the board for you. That's what a loom looks like. So that's a cloth loom. Probably about 3 or 4 feet high, maybe 3 or 4 feet wide. So this is the kind of contraption that she would have put Samson's hair in, would have tied it up. You know, I just said you have an idea of his hair being there. I mean, I think of it as if he's on the bed or whatever on her lap, she brings the loom over, or she had the loom there already. She starts to interweave his hair into the thread there, so it's all weaved in. All right, so when he wakes up, he's going to have that big thing on. Now, there is a sense in which, now I got that's supposed to be an ancient Hebrew loom from the time period. There are ones that are horizontal rather than vertical like that. There's some horizontal looms. So there is a couple of different types, but that is the one that's most common, is the vertical loom there. Can easily be done, but you imagine he's going to wake up and he's going to have that attached to him. And I've seen some looms that are portrayed like a large tennis racket, and there's Samson standing there, and he's going like this, and he's got this big wooden tennis racket on his back. I don't think that's the idea here. Anyway, so she weaves his hair, and we have this pagan lucky number 7 here with the 7 locks, and his hair was woven into the fabric. That's a typo. It should say his hair was woven into the fabric of the loom while still attached to Samson's head. So I can't imagine the intricacy and simply how Delilah accomplished this task. She could braid his hair, play with his hair easily enough while he's asleep. That's probably no problem. But how she attached the braids and interwove them into the loom without waking him, I'm not sure. And maybe this was attributed to Samson being a deep sleeper. Now, this is the idea. Even his hair was strong, as it seems that he had no problem just wrenching it out of the loom. So basically, he stood up, wrenched it out. I don't think we have a picture here of Samson carrying around the room, running around the room with this huge loom attached to his head. But even if that occurred, he lifted it off the ground. It's because his hair is strong too as well. So I have a picture of him just just shaking it off and the loom falling to the ground. So that's kind of the idea there. And hopefully I give you a little bit of a picture.
Can't believe how dumb he is.
Yeah, I was going to say next, like, I heard many suggestions, and you can read the commentaries, that Samson was dumb, or at least being dumb. You know, what in the world was he thinking, right? He had to have been stupid, especially after having this loom attached. And didn't he get it? Didn't he get it that she was doing something?
He's either tied up or
Well, you know, fool me once, you know, what is that? Shame on you. Fool me twice. Shame on me, right? Fool me 3 times, what is that?
I think God had something to do with it.
He had to think something was wrong as he woke up with his hair caught in his heavy loom. And so I asked, was it stupidity? Was it love? Was it arrogance? Now, here's what I think, at least on that end. Men can often be blinded by a seductive female, especially when lust is involved. It's like seeing red when you're angry. Sometimes men are like that, where they're in the throes of passion, they're in a passionate relationship like this, and they can't see straight. I'm willing to wager that this relationship was never appropriate, and pardon my expression, but I always got the sense that this was a very sleazy relationship. Sex is a very powerful weapon here, no matter what age we're talking about, now or back in 1100 BC or 1050 BC. Basically, Samson was completely blinded by his passion. So I don't know if you get the sense of that, and like I said, I've heard comments about, hey, he must have been stupid. But men act stupid in certain situations. The next verse makes it clear that she started nagging him, hounding him, no longer hiding the fact that she seemed to be only after this one thing. She wants to know. Finally, in verse 17, he cracks, and he tells her the truth. Now, this isn't the first time Samson did that, right? We've seen this before. Who else nagged him to death that he revealed a truth he wasn't ready to reveal? Where did we see this before? The riddle when he got married, right? The Philistine girl. He cracked that time as well. Why do you think Samson told her the truth when you read that? Don't read my words. What do you think? What did you think?
I thought he operates out of the flesh all the time, and when she keeps nagging him, he thinks he can just tell her the truth and that'll settle it.
Right.
He doesn't really think about the consequences, about the fact that, he's telling her the secret to his strength, and she's going to.
But do you think that he considered that she would ever betray him? Or he
I
didn't
think
care?
When you operate out of the flesh, you have a hard time seeing what is going to happen to you by making this foolish move.
Right.
Yeah, he's so focused on the short term, he's just tired of hearing her continue to go after him on the same topic. Oh, fine, I'll just tell you the truth. Like the judge that the woman keeps bringing the same case to.
Right.
Finally, he gives her a wish, right?
Yeah, that's a good example of that. Right. Nagging and nagging. You bring your complaint to the judge, and he finally rules in your favor. Right. That's a good example. Very good example. Certainly could be true. Anybody else have any thoughts?
He had to believe he was like invincible, because I mean it's apparent after the third time, like she's done the same exact thing, like Samson, the Philistines are upon you.
Every time she wakes up.
Right, I mean, so.
So you're going the arrogance route, like
Right.
blind arrogance.
Right, I mean, I can't imagine that like he didn't realize she wasn't, that she was up to no good. I mean, 3 times in a row.
He could be forgetful.
That is true.
That's true, but I mean,
Hey, you couldn't remember the last time, right? Last time he revealed a secret, all kinds of trouble happened, right? What bad could happen here? Yeah, that's all good. I think he realized, like what thought about it is that I think it was time to put up or shut up. He felt that he had to tell her or he had to give her up. I think they got to that point. So he either was going to reveal his secret to her or he had to end the relationship. And I think Samson chose not to end the relationship, but rather just to tell her. I think that he was faced with that choice, and that's the choice he made. You know, because obviously us on the other side going, just leave her, get out of there, find someone else. But I think that that's the option he was faced because it's happened 3 times. She's not given up, and he either's got to be truthful with her about this whole thing or he's got to go. And I think he knew that she wouldn't continue if he didn't tell her, so he just told her. Samson not only told her about his hair, but he also told her that he was a Nazarite to God since conception. Now, to Delilah, this had the ring of truth. It had to have. Because, as a matter of fact, she was so sure that this time Samson was telling the truth that the Philistine lords even brought her money this time when they came. Now, the passage seems to indicate, if you read through a couple of these verses, that the Philistine lords had lost interest after the 3 failed attempts. I don't know if you got that as you read. And they had went back to their own cities. And they had to be called back by Delilah. So it seems like they had went away. So she had to convince them to come back. And she must have been very convincing. I think she realized this time, I think I got the truth out of them. The only reason they would come back. Otherwise, they're like, no, we've 3 failed attempts, and I think they were done. So she convinced them. They came back. They brought the money. So in verse 19, she had Samson fall asleep on her knees, and I guess the local barber was pressing the service, and off went Samson's hair. Now, like other times, Delilah was careful. I think that's the idea here. Even though she swore this is 99% sure this is true, she was careful. Just in case, she called out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." Now, it doesn't explicitly say this in verse 20. But when he woke up, Samson thought, "I will shake myself free," was his thoughts as he's coming out of his sleep, which may mean that Delilah had tied him up. So if she was really careful, she probably actually tied him up this time after he was shaved. Now, I can't imagine her doing all this. Maybe, maybe not. But he thought, "I will shake myself free." It's going to be like every other time. Either way, I think the next phrase is one of the saddest in all the book. It says, "But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him." Samson's hair was not the source of Samson's strength. It was God. We have observed that Samson had already broken the other 2 parts of his Nazirite vow, probably more than once. His uncut hair was the only part of the vow left that hasn't been violated. It was his disobedience that cost him his freedom. This last part of his vow, he simply toyed with, offered it up as in a dangerous game that ended with a woman who readily stabbed him in the back. When his hair was cut, the vow ended, and so did the Lord's blessing. Simple as that. Now, it never entered his mind that the Lord would ever pull back his blessing. He took his special calling for granted all of his life, and guess what? I think as they gouged his eyes out in verse 21, he was finally able to see. Spiritually, not physically. When Samson lost his eyes, he finally understood for the first time in his life. Now, here's something I want to emphasize with you with regards to Samson. Samson never lost his faith. The problem that Samson had was that he wasn't faithful. He wasn't faithful to his vow. his calling, supposed to be calling, or his God. It reminds me of what happened in my own life as I stepped away from God for at least 15 years, 15 to 18 years. I stopped going to church. I stopped praying. I no longer hung out with my Christian friends. I no longer read the Bible. I stopped walking with my God. I still believed in Jesus. I knew who my Savior was. I never denied him. I didn't lose my faith or my salvation. No one can take that away. Even your own unfaithfulness cannot take that away. Once you are his, no one can snatch you out of his hand. But I wasn't faithful. For the 15 to 18 years of my life, I still had my faith, my saving faith, but I was unfaithful. That's what I was. I was simply disobedient and unfaithful. The Lord brought me to a point where I knew I had what I had done. I confessed, and I made a commitment to rededicate my life to the Lord. I had to relearn and be taught by God how to be faithful again. And if you think that's not true, that is the case. I had to relearn everything. Now, there's a true statement about a bike. That's right. You could go 5 or 10 years without riding a bike, but what's the deal? You get on that bike, right? And it's as if you haven't ridden for a couple of days, right? You can get right back on a bike and you start riding. That is not true about your faith, your walk with the Lord. It took me a while. I had to relearn and be taught by God how to be faithful again. That's true. It was a long and difficult process for me. Thankfully, in my case, I did not have to have my eyes gouged out to learn my lesson. Sadly, Samson did. Look where I am today. I'm sitting in front of you doing what I love. But it was a tough couple of years. These last 3 years, the last 4 years, been tough. Right? You know where I've come from. There's consequences to being unfaithful, but you'll never lose your faith. You'll never lose your saving faith. Once saved, always saved. The consequences of his disobedience had arrived on his own head. Isn't it ironic that the very instruments of his disobedience, right, his eyes, he saw, he lusted. He saw, he wanted. He used his eyes. They were his instruments, right? And it's true of Samson that he only did what was right in his own eyes. He did. And these instruments of his disobedience were plucked out. So they bound him and brought him down to Gaza, where he grinded grain for them. Now, just a side note on this, usually you see pictures of Samson pushing an ox-turn grain grinder. Does everybody know what an ox-turn grain grinder is? It kind of has the two millstones in the middle, right? And there's a pole, and the ox, would go around in a circle. And so if you watch Samson and Delilah, they have that scene where he's blind, but he's pushing this thing because, we want to see Samson as a manly man. He's pushing that ox grinder. That's the punishment the Philistines get. And he's not giving up, and he's using his muscles to grind grain for him. That actually is not what happened. That kind of grind grainer didn't exist. Archaeologists tell us that these were not used yet. More than likely, Samson ground grain by hand on a hand mill. So you ask, what kind of punishment was this? Okay, so what's the deal here? Samson had to grind grain by hand. Well, this work was tedious, one handful at a time. Tough. This wasn't easy. Matter of fact, it was so tough that they only used this labor for slaves and women. And no offense, women, I'm sorry. This tedious work was reserved mostly for women. So at the time, for such a manly man to be doing such work would have really basically made Samson a laughingstock. Okay? That's what he was, a laughingstock. And I believe that they bound him, that he was probably required to do this work in full view of others every day. Probably what they did. Put him in full view, see him grinding grade. You could probably go to visit Samson and see the great mighty warrior, to see him grind grain, do women's work. It's really how he was paraded. And that leaves us at verse 22. Now, does anybody have a couple minutes in them? Do you want to finish the chapter or do you want to close? How does everybody feel? Keep going? All right. Let's read verses 22 for the rest of the chapter. If you have to go, please don't hesitate to leave. However, the hair of his head began to grow again, and after it was shaved off. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us." And it so happened that when they were in high spirits, that they said, "Call for Samson, that he may amuse us." So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. And they made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I might lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And about 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on while Samson was amusing them. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he braced himself against them, the one in his right hand and the other on his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him, brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Thus he judged Israel 20 years. Verse 22 begins by telling us that Samson's hair began to grow. Now, I think the idea here is that as Samson's hair began to grow as a sign of his vow, his relationship with God was being repaired. I believe that there is a physical and a spiritual parallel in this passage. He had a lot of time to think and to repent of all the things he had done, of all his failings. So along with some amount of physical strengthening as his hair grows, right, we have Samson was being spiritually strengthened, which would lead him basically to the continuance of his Nazirite vow, although briefly, right? Didn't last very long. So in verse 23, the Philistines held a festival in which sacrifices were made to their god Dagon. Dagon was the god of the harvest. Now, he is the fish god because they're the people from the sea. But they went to Dagon. He was really basically a god of the harvest. So this is more than likely probably an agricultural celebration of some sort. Now, even though it was usually held for the specific purpose of praising Dagon, they used it on this occasion as an opportunity to mock and ridicule Samson. They brought him out to show all the people how this great warrior had fallen. This mighty Hebrew warrior, this one-man terror, was reduced to nothing more than a useless blind fool. They rejoiced as they claimed, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands." They attributed Samson's demise as the work of Dagon. Furthermore, they say that this proves that Dagon is stronger than Jehovah. Now, we talked about this in the past. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, the army that won the battle generally had the stronger god. So God's reputation, his Shem, had been tarnished. Samson's unfaithfulness and subsequent fall reflected badly on God, at least in front of the other people. Now, Isn't it a shame when God's people, New or Old Testament, 1,300 years, 1,300, 1,200, 1,100 BC, or 2021? Isn't it a shame when God's people become a source of ridicule for the true and living God? Jesus was teaching this principle when he said, "Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Matthew 5:16. And this was written by the Apostle Peter. "Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation." Your behavior matters to God. What you do in public makes a difference. It matters in our own lives as well as in the lives of the people of God during the time of the judges. Going back to my own example of unfaithfulness, anyone who found out that I was a Christian during those days was surprised. Why? Why do you think they were so surprised? Because my behavior looked nothing like it was supposed to look like, even if it's a distorted view of Christianity that an unbeliever has.
Unbelievers are experts on how Christians should live.
That is true. They do judge pretty harshly. See, during those times, the problem was this. I certainly never acted like one. And I was no different than the unbelievers, and I sometimes went out of my way to show it. It was just like them. Not any different. But we're to be salt and light, as Israel was to be salt and light to the nations around them. As Samson was supposed to represent God, we represent God by the things that we do, right? So after enduring more ridicule, they placed Samson between two pillars. Now, usually, this might not mean anything to you. The pillars of the day were not one piece, but they were rather a series of circular slabs placed one on top of the other. And he asked the boy who was responsible for leading him around to help him find the foundational pillars, feigning the need to rest. He was tired. And it states in verse 27 that this temple structure was full. It had most of the elite, including the 5 lords of the Philistines. They would have generally been on the bottom floor, underneath. 3,000 additional men and women were on the roof. They were the regular folk. They got the roof seating for these type of things. And that amount of men and women up top there would have made that roof unstable. Samson then prays to the Lord and asks for one more bout of strength. The Lord answered his prayer as a final act of restoring Samson by his grace. This would also mean the end of his life. So he pushed a circular slab, probably one of them, knocking it out of joint of each pillar with all of his God-given strength, and the temple came tumbling down on a great many Philistines. Actually, we are told that he killed more Philistines with this one act than he did in all the prior conflicts combined. He previously, at least the ones we're given, killed just over about 1,000 Philistines in his life, from 14:19, 15:8, and 15:16. And here, over 3,000 here. In verse 31, it says that Samson's family and his brothers went to this fallen temple to claim the body of Samson, and even though they were enemies, safe passage rights would have been customarily extended to his family. According to the Bible and other records, Samson was an only child. Most people agree. So the brothers here were probably not in the biological sense of brothers, but the general sense. It was more than likely members of his clan that came to get his body, including family members like uncles would have come, cousins, other family members. This gathering of the body, when after battle, this kind of gathering was the responsible for the next of kin. So the people that went down was Samson's next of kin. Samson judged Israel for 20 years. And that is chapter 16. Anybody have any questions about the chapter we just went over? Liz.
You want me to get the microphone? I don't know. I think that when he says in verse 28, he says, "Oh God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines from my two eyes."
Mm-hmm.
It's always been about him.
Yep. Very good.
So this is just me, I'm not quite sure if God grew his hair back for Samson's purposes or for his own. Because in my mind, it's always been about him. God, I'm thirsty. God, I did that. God, I want. God, give me this, give me that. And then his last request is like, give me back my strength so that I can avenge that I lost my eyes. And so
Very good. Yep.
was it about, was God really giving him, was God really being gracious to him, or was God was going to find his own way to get his own glory for what had been done?
Well, let me give you an example, and let's point it out and look at the parallel. When there was trouble in the wilderness, right, and God is going to he's going to take care of the Israelites. He's had enough of them, right? And Moses intercedes for the people. What thinking did Moses use, or what did he say to God to get God to relent, even though we know he doesn't change his mind? But how did he approach God? What did he say to God about if he killed all of them?
Yeah, that was the whole thing. That's what I'm saying. It's like.
But answer the question about Moses. Do you know what he did?
Well, didn't Moses say to God, like, how's this going to kind of look?
To you, against who? The Israelites or Moses or to God?
What?
Right, God. No, God, right? It's the exact point you're making. When Moses interceded for the people, Moses was concerned about God's Shem, his name, his reputation. It's your reputation. It's you. What you brought out, what I'm saying is what you brought out is absolutely goes with what I totally 100% agree. Samson, it was about himself, about avenging himself, his own two eyes. It was not about, it should have been about the ridicule that they were, and the reputation that these people were saying that Dagon, who is not a God at all, basically beat Jehovah. It should have, for Samson, it should have been about avenging his God and restoring God's name, right?
Yeah, right.
But it was about what?
It was about his own.
Yeah.
Once again, well, at least he's consistent.
I was going to bring this out in my notes. I left it out because I've been killing Samson so badly. I didn't want to, the guy's dying, and I didn't want to bring that up. But I'm glad that you did, because I thought the same thing as well.
Well, but the thing is that I think it's it's a really to me it's a very sad story.
It is.
About it's just a sad story that he was just so when you were talking earlier. He was truly a narcissist. It was all about him. His wants, his needs, you know what I'm saying? And so I think he was, I think like even with Delilah, he was showing her, that, again, that, that kind of, oh, all right, well, I'll wake up and I'll get myself free, and I'll wake up and I'll get myself free. And so he doesn't really, he had no care for anyone or anything other than himself, his wants, his needs.
Right. I agree. And that was a very good observation at the end there. I was wondering, and I was going to put it as a question in here to see if anybody caught verse 28. If anybody ever had any thoughts about that. Mayor, I think me and you talked about this weeks ago, a couple weeks ago, right? Didn't we? And I say something about that? I thought, I don't know if I should bring that up. I've been killing Samson. So, yeah, I thought the same thing, that it wasn't about God. It wasn't about how God's reputation is being made fun of right here, about God being avenged and God's name is Shem being restored. It was about him, right?
Yeah, it's very sad.
Very, very sad. Pastor George.
Point, counterpoint. Samson was egotistical. He was focused on himself. He was he was kind of like the foxes tied together in, with torches, just burning down everything that was Philistine, even to his last moment. And God used, it was almost like those foxes or jackals, clearing out all the Philistines in this generation, or start the process of starting to fight against the Philistines. Interestingly, he makes it into the Heroes of Faith chapter, Hebrews 11. It says in 32, "What more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, and shut the mouths of lions."
Well, but he had the faith that he knew that God would do it.
Yes.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Very good,
But he
yeah.
didn't do it, he wasn't asking for it for God's glory, he was asking it for himself. But I think he had the faith that God would restore him.
And as we look at Samson's life, we see the clay feet, we see the selfishness, and it's there, and we have to be honest, we have to see it. Just like, whenever people talk about David, what is the first thing that people usually say about David? Bathsheba, right?
Right.
Forget about the fact that he led the
Slew
people
Goliath,
all
and it
those
was an
years.
amazing story.
Goliath, went out in the armies, killed all these Philistines, restored the nation, brought it to a place where they're all the 12 tribes. You look at this mishmash in Judges and think about it's not that many generations where Samuel and David are going to get the whole nation together, basically worshiping God.
Right.
And reestablish the temple worship and everything. Well,
Yep,
what's
ordering
the
the
first thing people
priesthood,
remember?
right.
Bathsheba,
Right.
right? And the point I'm trying to make is, in the book of Hebrews, and it talks about the heroes of faith, it doesn't mention David and Bathsheba. It
Right.
doesn't mention Samson.
Doesn't mention all
How
their
selfish he
mistakes
was.
and terrible things.
It really, and God, when we stand before the Lord and Bema seat, all those things that were done out of selfishness are going to burn up. And what's God going to remember? He's going to remember those acts of faith. Yeah.
Good, great point. Yeah.
So we're going to, all those things that we might be embarrassed about, the 15 lost years of our life or something like that, guess what? Probably it's going to be, a lot of that's just going to be
It's going to be burned up,
right
right?
in front of us. But what remains is those times that we served the Lord and we did walk by faith and we did things for His glory, and God's going to remember that, which is kind of really a great blessing.
Right. But, my point would be is if I was writing Hebrews chapter 11, I would have left Samson out. I had to put that in there. I wouldn't have added him. I would have, there's some other guys there. I'm sorry. Although, you know what? It reminds me of who? Was it Peter and Lot? Is Peter the one that mentions that faithful man, Lot? Isn't that Peter's book? And you're like, what? What? And if he hadn't said that, I would have never included Lot like in any example I would ever make, right? So.
Well, it says, one of my favorite verses is, the Lord says, I will restore the years that the locusts have eaten.
Yeah, that's your verse.
And that is so the Lord, it just shows the Lord, like, no matter what we do, He looks on your heart and He rewards those small, even if it were just a few little glimpses, like He sees that.
But how much grace did he show Samson? I mean, really.
Absolutely.
If you could see it all throughout the story, right? Grace and patience, loving. I'm sorry, Pastor George, what were you going to say?
No, I agree. That's all.
Oh, you were, okay. I didn't know if you had anything else to add. There.
Well, Samson's always been one of those characters I like. He puzzles me like crazy, right? But then when you get into Hebrews, like Pastor, that has been my moment of clarity, really, the book of Hebrews, and seeing Samson there, because you see, not just Samson, there's two other judges from the time of the judges. We think this is a terrible period, there's no doubt about it.
Right.
Barak.
And yet, he's writing to the Jewish
Jephthah.
people who kept wanting to go
Yeah,
back
Jephthah.
to obeying the law and doing this and doing doing that to pleasing of the Lord. And the faith chapter is all about, this is grace, guys. This is all of grace. This isn't what you do or what you didn't do. We will be judged for how we live. Like Samson's got losses, there's no doubt about that. But he's in heaven and he's in that faith chapter because of his faith.
Right.
And I don't know what maybe Pastor George could mention this, but it says he called upon the Lord, capital Lord. And then it said, he said, "O Lord," capital L, small O-R-D, and then capital G-O-D. So personally, I believe, and then it says.
Well, the Lord is usually the name. When it's a capital L-O-R-D, it's Yahweh or Jehovah,
Yes,
like
but
the name.
I think there's a good message there is what I'm saying. If you
Right.
really took the time to evaluate it, it would tell you more about what he was really believing about God, I think, at that point.
He did show faith.
Yes, exactly.
But, he also showed his other colorful qualities when he did that, because I think that Liz is right. There was a selfishness about the crying out to the Lord there. He wanted to be avenged for what they did to him. He wasn't concerned about the Lord's name. He wasn't concerned about what they were saying about his God. And if he would have had his head on straight, and we talk about, like, he got his eyes gouged out, and they probably had to do a lot of soul searching, but he still had that characteristic of that's the way he thought.
But on the other side, he said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He wasn't saying, "Let me live." He wasn't asking for God to give that. It was like he recognized he deserved that.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I don't see a
Or maybe he didn't want to live without two eyes.
No, he is, obviously.
It was too degrading to him to live without two eyes. I'm only throwing it out as a suggestion. I don't know about that. He would have been a blind beggar if he lived on, or I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Not saying that's true. But we got to give Samson some credit, right? He's in Hebrews 11, so right?
Somehow he made the cut.
The Holy Spirit and the writer of Hebrews, Paul, added him in.
Leaves things out.
Yeah, my last thing was just to go over, but we had talked so much in the beginning, was just to say, what are some of the applications of the life of Samson? We did a great job with a lot of stuff that we went over, and I hope I did a good job explaining the chapter and going through these things with you. I do want to say this, if you're going to read ahead, that the last 5 chapters of the book of Judges is an appendix. So I wanted to give you little bit tidbits of information so that you know, okay? So the appendix, the last 5 chapters, it's not chronological. In other words, the events of the 5 chapters we're going to go over next did not happen after the time of Samson. As a matter of fact, they generally think this occurred in the middle to the beginning of the time of the Judges, as you read those. So it's not a chronological account. And the purpose of it was added in by the author to try to give you a view into Israelite life. I mean, that's kind of the idea here. We're going to read some very weird, odd things that go on. And the basic, what we're going to be doing is going over, what does this show about the time of the Judges? All right, so I don't want you to think when you read 17, and you can get into 18 if you want to verse 12, because we might get into 18. But I don't want you to think of this happening after the time of Samson. This is just thrown in there. There's no chronological, I don't want to say that. It's not chronological. All right? Everybody understand that? So you know what you're reading. And I'll go over that in the introduction next week, so we know what we're up against and what we're going through. All right, let's pray. I kept you long enough. Great job tonight, everybody. Let's go to the Lord and thank him for tonight's study. Dear Heavenly Father, these studies are wonderful because you have a bunch of your people here come and they really want to study and talk about your word, and we love you and just all the amazing things we can learn from even such an odd chapter or an odd man's life. Not really understanding much of what he did, but just kind of pulling out those applications and things that we can take with us during the week. I mean, it's just amazing. So thank you for this book of Judges, and thank you for giving me the wisdom and strength to lead this study. Just thank you for every heart and mind who's here tonight and at home. I just pray you keep everyone safe as they travel home. Thank you again for your word, and thank you all for all